Hey, welcome to a thawing out edition, I should say, of Big Deep Breath Friday. We're coming to you live, a broadcast here from Houston, where we've just gone through what many people are calling the snowpocalypse. People moved to Houston so that we don't have to go through weather like this, but it found us nonetheless. Man, we are super blessed and privileged to be joined today by Mr. Waters Davis. Waters is the former president of Reliant Energy Retail. He was the one that led the development of that branch of Reliant Energy when Texas deregulated in the early 2000s. He's a good friend and brother in the Lord, and he is definitely an expert in the field who for the past 20 years has been doing a lot of consulting work with many different electricity retail providers. So Waters, in the first place, thank you very much for giving us some of your time today, brother.
Jim, thank you for letting me speak on this. I am somewhat opinionated about it, but let me just start by saying I'm not going to argue for the Democratic position or the Republican position on this. I'm going to try to just give you as many good facts as possible.
Hey, that's great, man. We were talking before we came on just about frustration, right? I mean, with respect to electricity, I'm sophomoric at best. I don't know a whole lot about nothing. And I'm just in a position where I'd like to be able to have some good, solid information so that for me and my family and for other people that I have responsibility for, I'd like to be able to make some good, solid decisions, both in the present and in the future, to be able to protect my family against potential future blackouts like what we've had this week. And it really is frustrating to have to weed through all of the different information that we just get bombarded with. It feels so politicized, a lot of flame throwing and finger pointing, but not a whole lot of people just giving us good, solid information. So again, I appreciate your time today and look forward to hearing what you have to say based on your experience in the industry. So let me jump right into it and just ask you right off the bat, what, in your opinion, what caused the Texas power grid to fail so marvelously this past week?
Okay. So let me start by sharing a lesson learned in the area of complex systems theory. So it goes like this. Every system is perfectly designed to deliver the results that you're getting. So if you don't like the results, you got to go back and look at the entire system. You can't just pick out one element and say, well, it's the wind that failed, or it's the coal plants that failed, or it was colder than usual. You have to look at the entire system. So let me just kind of walk through a little bit about what happened. I mean, the facts are more than 4 million people in the state of Texas were without power on Wednesday, led to loss of life, led to loss of pumping power to get water where it was needed, and created tremendous property damage and hardship for many, many different people. So ultimately, if you peel back that layer and look, well, what really happened? So what really happened is 46,000 megawatts of electricity, which is a little more than half of the system that's available in the winter, failed to operate. And so let's kind of peeling that back. What makes up generating capacity in the state of Texas? At the very core, the base load stuff is run by nuclear plants. Nuclear plants are designed to fire up and run continuously. We have some nuclear, not a huge amount. The next layer is coal plants. Coal plants are also designed to fire up and run pretty much continuously. They have very little ability to ramp up or ramp down without really hurting the equipment. The next layer of electricity is run by combined cycle gas plants, and so gas plants are really made to operate on a variable basis and be able to ramp up when the load is at its peak, which is generally in the summer in Texas, although we had a winter peak this year.
Yeah.
And then ramp back down, and they are all three of those sources of generation are generally thought to be conventional power. They're the most reliable. They operate day in and day out. And then on top of that, Texas has a lot of wind power as far as states go, and a little bit of solar power. So the Public Utility Commission and passed rules 20 years ago to subsidize the development of wind power. And that has led, I believe, to roughly 20,000 megawatts of wind power in the state of Texas, which is more than any other state has. Now, I'll just mention a little bit about wind and solar power right now. Wind is great when it's windy, but when the wind doesn't blow, guess what? Those turbines don't spin. So if you've ever been out to West Texas and driven through there are days when those things are all spinning, and then there are days when they just sit there. And when they sit there, they don't produce any electricity. So that's just they're intermittent sources of electrical power. Solar is a little bit more predictable. Obviously, it works well during the day when the sun's out, but it doesn't work very well when it's covered with snow and ice, and the coldest temperatures are at night when you need the most electricity. So it's another intermittent source of generation. So what happened? We lost 46,000 megawatts of power. 28,000 of that, or a little less than 2/3, was from natural gas, coal, and nuclear. And then the balance, 18,000 megawatts, was lost from wind and solar. So there's enough blame to go around, whether you're a conventional power generation guy or whether you're a green energy guy. Neither one of them performed the way they were supposed to. And so let's go back and look at why is that? So basically the state of Texas deregulated wholesale power generation around the year 2002, actually. And they put in a whole bunch of rules for formerly investor-owned electric utilities. It used to be Houston Lighting and Power back then, and Texas Utilities up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and CPU down in the Corpus Christi area. And basically, they deregulated the industry. They spun off generation, which is now owned by a bunch of private companies. Well, some of them are public, but they're non-government entities. And then they set up the retail energy providers. So the people you buy your electricity from, whether it's Reliant or Discount Power or somebody like that, they don't own any generation.
Yeah.
They go out and they buy generation from these independent third parties. And they buy it obviously at the lowest possible cost. And this isn't the first time Texas has experienced cold weather or had rolling blackouts. They experienced in 2011 was the last time we had rolling blackouts in Texas. And they did a big federal study of what happened, and the federal agencies issued guidelines for how to invest in our conventional generation in order for it to operate properly in cold weather. But the state of Texas failed to mandate those requirements. So they were issued as advisory guidelines. Everybody hoped that people would do that. The state provided a little bit of economic incentive for generators to be able to stay online, but it wasn't sufficient to motivate them to spend large amounts of capital for an occurrence that might only occur once every 10 years when it gets really, really cold in the winter. So without regulations to require this, it's all three sources of conventional generation, nuclear, coal, and gas plants were not designed and not built to operate in 14-degree weather in the city of Houston. So they can be, and they operate very effectively in much colder weather than that all over the country. So it's not an engineering problem, it's a policy problem. And so it ultimately goes back to the government in the state of Texas.
It's a policy problem because those companies and service providers, generators in northern states understand that that's just a cost of doing business that cuts into profit that the Texas companies didn't want to incur. Yeah.
So in like I live currently in Colorado right now. So in Colorado, electricity is not deregulated. It's a heavily regulated industry, and one of the requirements, if you're going to provide generation in the state of Colorado, is it's got to operate at very cold temperatures, because it gets very cold year after year after year. And there are federal and state regulations to winterize all of the investment in power generation. There are no state regulations, and there are no federal regulations in the state of Texas currently to winterize any of the generation, whether it's renewables or whether it's conventional.
So the issue really isn't, if I'm hearing you right, the issue really isn't nuclear, coal, gas plants, conventional or renewable. The issue is whatever you have has got to be winterized for whatever weather temperatures it's coming up against in the cold.
Right. So that's one requirement. The other requirement is you have to have enough generating capacity to operate in extreme weather conditions.
Yeah.
And that's generally extreme weather conditions in Texas occur during the summer when everybody's cranking up their air conditioning. And that's what all of the system is really planned for. So they take about 20% of the generating capacity down during the winter to do preventative maintenance on the plants and get them ready to run at top condition during the course of the summer. So Texas was already at a risk factor because 20% of the generation wasn't even designed to run this winter, which is typical of every winter. And then we had, I still get the Chronicle. It looks like Texas had Houston had a low reading of like 14 degrees on Wednesday. It may have been lower in some parts of the city than that. That was actually colder than it was up here in the mountains in Colorado that day.
Yeah, thanks.
So, I spent 60 years living in Houston, and I don't ever remember it getting below 20 degrees. 14 degrees is just really cold. And not only that, it stayed below freezing for 4 or 5 days. So the combination of those two events is unprecedented. And there were no requirements to build facilities to operate in those kind of conditions. And currently, there is no statewide requirement to build spare generating capacity. The building of spare generating capacity is left up to third parties who have to go out and spend a lot of money, and they're not going to spend a lot of money to build a generating plant that's only going to operate once every 10 years.
Yeah.
They don't make any money to do that. So it really comes back to the regulations in Texas are all meant to do two things. One, subsidize the wind industry so Texas can continue to lead the United States in producing wind, and two, provide the lowest possible cost of electricity for all of the different homeowners and businesses and industrial users in the state of Texas. And Texas does a pretty good job of that. The cost of electricity relative to other states is let's just say low. It's in the probably lowest third of all the states out there. So it does a good job of low cost electricity, but it comes at the risk of a lack of requirements to operate in extreme winter conditions. Everything's focused on operating in extreme summer conditions, but not winter conditions.
Well, so let me ask you this, right? So depending on the time and the provider, because everything's deregulated, let's say I'm in depending on what the plan is, let's say I'm in the 9 to 13 cent a kilowatt hour for my electricity bill. What's on average? What am I looking at in Colorado?
We pay right around 11 to 12 cents.
Oh, so it's in the same.
Yeah, same zip code. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's for the retailer, for me, for Jim Stern and his family turning the lights on. What benefit do I get out of deregulation?
You have choices. So in the old days, you had only one provider. It was Houston Lighting and Power if you lived in Houston.
I remember.
And if you lived over in the Woodlands, there's another provider in the Woodlands, Entergy. But so you could only buy from one group, and there was only one price out there.
Yeah.
Today, there are probably 100 different retail energy providers selling power in Houston. and they have all different kinds of plans. Some of them have free or lower cost energy at night, some on weekends, some, so everybody's got their own flavor of the sauce, and people get to choose electricity just like they choose a cell phone provider or something else. But it's ultimately not the retail electric provider that failed here. It's the state regulations that govern the wholesale generation providers. They're the ones that failed here.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, I understand the retail guys are downstream, certainly, and because somebody had to, at the state government level, somebody had to agree to deregulate. The deregulating was a good idea. Again, it just seems like if the government is set up for the people, by the people, and of the people, and the people are supposed to be the beneficiaries of government policy, and deregulation has not benefited me as a citizen of Texas in net monthly energy savings, and yet I have to go through, I'm out of my house. I've been out of my house for 5 days now without power for 4. Now my water pipe broke. And that's the benefit that I get of deregulation. I'd rather go back to regulated energy as the end user, because I don't really understand what the benefit is to me for deregulation.
So I'll just defend deregulation for a second. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay?
Come on, man.
So deregulation by itself is not the fault here. It's the amount of regulation that's built into the deregulated system. So the only thing that's true, well, there's two things that are deregulated. One is the ownership of the generating capacity is deregulated. And the second one is the provider of retail electricity services is deregulated. So you have your choice about who you want to buy electricity from. And then those providers, let's just say whether it's TXU or Reliant, they have a choice about where they're going to go buy their generating capacity. Yeah. And they go out and they buy a large part of their generating capacity months and months ahead of time because it's less expensive. And then they buy as little as possible in the day ahead market based on exactly what the weather's going to do that day, because it always gets more expensive right up until the very last day. Yeah. So let me talk about who's really to blame for this, because I wouldn't say deregulation is the fault of it. I'd say it's the lack of appropriate regulatory policies that are part of the entire Texas environment that is the culprit here. So, the buck always stops at the top. So Governor Greg Abbott is falling on his sword on this, and he essentially said, "I'm going to fix ERCOT." So the governor has huge ultimate responsibility for infrastructure like the electrical grid either working or not working in the state of Texas. Underneath the governor, of course, is the legislature. The legislature is the only entity that can pass laws. The government can champion laws, but ultimately it's the legislature that has to pass them. And that legislature, every person serving in state government, has to take care of mom and pop residential customer, has to take care of commercial business customers, and has to take care of industrial customers. And everybody wants low rates. So most of the time, nobody pounds on legislatures to pass regulations. What they pound on their legislators is keep our electricity rates low. And then, so once every 2 years, the legislature gets together and passes laws that broadly govern how the state of Texas is going to be run, and ultimately how the electricity grid is going to be run. Generally, though, there are not new laws every 2 years on electricity because it's generally thought to work pretty well. Then there's a group of public utility commissioners that are full-time jobs, and I think there are 3 of them right now in the state of Texas. It's their job day to day to put the right policies in place for the grid to function effectively. And these are not politicians. They're appointed by the governor, and they're generally good, hardworking folks. Some of them are more technical than others, but they all want to do a good thing. They all want to do 2 things. They want a reliable grid, and they want a low-cost electricity. And for some reason, decided 20 years ago to have a lot of wind power. And then they delegate the physical operation of the grid across the entire state of Texas to a group called ERCOT. ERCOT sits up in Austin, and ERCOT is ultimately the controller of which generating units run at any one point in time. So they dispatch, is the term they use, energy as demand increases. And so those three entities are ultimately the folks that have to bear the brunt of this. And I've already heard Abbott saying that he's going to fix ERCOT. You know, it's not really ERCOT; it's Public Utility Commission that has more egg on their face right now than anybody, because the Public Utility Commission has the authority to mandate that generating facilities can operate in all kinds of extreme weather conditions, and they just have failed to do that.
Well, that's interesting, man. 5 days ago, if you would have asked me who ERCOT is or what ERCOT was, I wouldn't have been. I would have thought they misspelled Epcot at Disney. I've heard ERCOT more than anything else in the past 5 days. I haven't, and I've read a lot on this issue. I haven't read anything about the public utility commissioners. Maybe they're doing a good job of diverting attention to ERCOT, because ERCOT's a lot easier to remember than public utility commissioners.
Yeah, the public utility commissioners are hiding right now. And, you know, recently a few things have come out about ERCOT. Apparently the head guy at ERCOT currently lives in the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
And the vice chairman lives in Germany, of all places. So, you know, that's on Abbott. How Abbott allowed that to occur is beyond me, but it's completely his responsibility to appoint people to ERCOT. They're not elected officials.
Oh, even ERCOT's not elected. I know the Public Utility Commission is appointed, but ERCOT is appointed also.
Yeah. So it's it all falls back on the legislature and the governor and the public utility commissioners. You know, ERCOT doesn't pass rules. They make suggestions to the public utility commissioners, but they don't pass rules. They just operate under the rules that are promulgated by the public utility commissioners.
Well, I mean, right. And, you know, if we have a 1 in 10 year, you said the last time we had rolling blackouts was 2011. I don't seem to remember those, obviously, as memorable as this event will be. And what I read is that the last time we had temperatures anywhere near this cold was 1989. So I imagine a scenario where you have some very big shot utility companies, generators, coming to public utility commissioners and making sure that the public utility commissioners don't put unnecessary squeezes on them for profitability, and then even just for doing an incredible amount of work for something that you may never use, and historically you've never really had to use.
Right.
And so, you know, I get. It's a little bit frustrating that we in our culture today are so fast to just shred people and want to destroy people's lives and careers on things that historically, I mean, you're working off a 30-year trend. Who in their family prepares for things in their family that haven't happened in 30 years?
Yeah.
The vast majority of us don't plan for those things. Or if you do, you're called a hoarder or a conspiracy theorist. And so we don't operate our families that way. It's somewhat understandable that we wouldn't operate our state that way. Although in something that is severe as power, you would think they would have some kind of a better idea of an emergency to the emergency backup plan that would okay, we got to bring in supply from other places. And I understand that Texas is alone, right? There's the Western and the Eastern interconnect, and then Texas is alone. And so it's not that easy for us to borrow power from other places, or
physically, we have very little ability to import power from outside the state. So the Texas grid operates somewhat as an island compared to the rest of the United States. So the rest of the United States ships power from one state to the other all the time. And that's just the way the grid is designed. It's all federally controlled. But the state of Texas, being as independent as it always has been, starting with the Alamo, has chosen to go its own way, and as a result, it is free from federal regulation of the electrical grid. So when different politicians say we need to join the federal system, what they're really saying is we need to bring the regulatory mandate up to the federal level to operate Texas power plants and not leave it up to the state government to do that. So if you're a Democrat, typically you think that's a good idea. If you're a Republican and you hate, federal regulation, like Perry does, you fiercely stand on your soapbox and say, we'd rather freeze in the dark than let the federal government tell us how to run our power plants. I mean, obviously there's a better solution. The state could do it. And I think given the amount of pain that has been suffered in the last week, you will see some new regulations come out of both the legislature, the Public Utility Commission that will try to prevent this from happening. Now, it may cost a little bit more. Your electricity rates may go up 10%, but every 10 years you won't have to worry about rolling blackouts. Let me just mention one thing. So rolling blackouts are typically what happens when you lose generating capacity and you can't meet all the demand in a particular area. Many people in Texas, or in Houston anyway, did not get to experience rolling blackouts. I have friends, as I'm sure you do, that were out for days on end. So when you lose half of the generating capacity, you don't have enough capacity in the system to move it around different parts of the city. When you lose, say, 20% of what you need, then you can decide, to turn Jim's neighborhood off for 6 hours and move it over to my neighborhood and then move it over to the next neighborhood. But when you lose half of it, you got to just make hard decisions. And, so who makes those decisions? Ultimately, ERCOT tells CenterPoint, you've got to shed half your load.
Wow.
So that came down from ERCOT. CenterPoint looked around and said, who are we going to shed? Well, CenterPoint probably did the right thing from a use standpoint. So that CenterPoint shut down a lot of residential areas that used a large amount of electricity, River Oaks being one of them. So all those great big houses in River Oaks and many of them in West U, they were shut down. Now, they weren't the only two areas of the city that were shut down, but they didn't try to be politically correct and protect the rich folks, and just pick on the poor folks. They shut down all the major users of electricity because they're trying to protect the integrity of the system. When it gets into engineering, you have to have the right amount of voltage support in the grid so that when you turn the lights on, they actually come on. And if you lose the voltage support, the whole city can go dark. So the last people that they're going to cut are the hospitals. So they'll cut industrial facilities, they'll cut commercial facilities, they'll cut residential facilities in order to keep the life safety facilities on board. And it's just never happened before that they've had to cut half the load in the city of Houston.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a meme going around on Facebook about I'm tired of being told that I'm living through something that's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Unprecedented has become the new four-letter word of 2021. But there was that picture. See if you can speak to this. I don't know if you saw it. There was a picture from Tuesday night or Wednesday night where the vast majority of Houston is blacked out and downtown is brilliantly lit up. Like whatever CenterPoint cut, whatever the zip code is around downtown, that one didn't get touched.
Yeah. So that downtown area is all underground power. So all those facilities are controlled by underground duct banks, is what they call them, or just say wiring, groups of wiring that connect all those. It's the most secure area in the city because it doesn't have any overhead power lines that can freeze and therefore fall down. Now, somebody made a decision to keep downtown on. I don't know exactly how that decision was made. Probably in retrospect, they should have cut the commercial buildings. I saw Sylvester complaining about that, so they could keep more hospitals on. I know Methodist Hospital lost several facilities in the outlying areas. And, all the hospitals have backup generation, as does the water system. The water system actually has backup generation to make the pumps run so people can get water. Problem is they've never tested it when it's been 14 degrees outside. So even the backup generators didn't run as designed, because you can't test something for 14 degrees when it's never 14 degrees.
Yeah.
You can plan for it, but you really can't test it to see how well it operates relative to design capacity.
Yeah, I mean, it really does look like everything that could have gone wrong absolutely went wrong. And so for me as a homeowner, for me as a dad, right? I got a wife, I got two little kiddos. I got a 14-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I want to be able to trust my state government for services that they purport to be able to provide. All of us pay a good enough amount of tax money that it's not unreasonable to expect that our government can create infrastructure systems that don't fall apart so magnificently as they did this time around. Nevertheless, people are fallible. Governments are fallible. Life is chaotic, as you and I know, as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. Earth is just a chaotic mess anyway. Unpredictable things happen. What can I do as a homeowner, as a private citizen, right? I'm not going to go to the Public Utility Commission and with my little picket and say, regulate. They're not going to listen to me too much. What can I do to cover my family, or in the event for future scenarios? What's my best case solution for keeping my flock safe and warm?
So I would start by putting political pressure on your state legislature. So you've got some state legislator guy or girl who is responsible for the area of the city that you live in. I would certainly light up that phone, come next week, along with thousands of other people that are going to be doing that and clamoring that they fix this system that's broken. The other thing you can do is really much more on a personal basis, much like you prepare for a hurricane. So now that you know what can happen when really cold weather is coming, you have to prepare for a loss of power and figure out how you're going to operate through a loss of power. So you need plenty of flashlights. I don't suggest candles, plenty of flashlights and alternative kind of lighting sources. You also ought to fill up all the bathtubs, because you could lose water, as happens. So if you at least have water in your bathtubs, you can flush your toilets. Make sure you have plenty of food in order, because the grocery stores get wiped out. And I'd say plenty of spare drinking water, just like you would in a hurricane. So you do all that, and then Texans really for the first time have learned how to turn off the water supply that goes into their house and drain the pipes. That's done regularly in northern climates when you leave or when you think you might experience a loss of electricity. It's in my experience, it was never done in Houston. No one ever talked about turning off the water supply and draining the pipes. But ultimately, that'll prevent the kind of leak damage that you had at your house, and that, my guess is at least half the city of Houston has water leak problems right now. Because as long as electricity is running, there'll be enough heat in the house to keep the pipes from freezing most of the time.
Yeah.
But when you cut the electricity, and in some cases you also cut the water, supply to the house, everything is just left there to freeze. And when it stays freezing for several days on end, those pipes are going to break. And
yeah, in time, I felt like it was colder in my house than it was outside. A buddy just sent me a picture earlier today of water coming out of his faucet that had frozen coming out of his faucet. And the thermostat in his house, when the electricity came back on, said it was 20 degrees inside his house.
Wow. Yeah, that can happen because so outside the sun's going to warm things up, but inside, if you don't have a way of getting all that sun energy inside the house, it can actually stay colder in the house than it is outside during the day.
Yeah, it would seem to me I'm looking at getting some kind of right-sized portable generator, as well as some kind of, in camping, they have pretty sophisticated water filtration systems that can at least get you some clean drinking water. It's not a permanent solution. It's not even a 3-week or a month solution in many cases, but it'll get you by a couple days, a couple weeks as you need it. And so there's some pretty sophisticated water filtration systems that you can get that aren't too costly, as well as some lower end generators that they might not be able to run your entire house. You might not be able to afford that, but they can at least get you a refrigerator and 1 or 2 rooms of comfort where you don't feel so exposed to all of this Byzantine Abbott legislature, Public Utility Commission, ERCOT. Hey, I don't care. I pay taxes. I just want the lights to come on when I flip the switch.
So a whole home generator will typically cost somewhere between, say, $7,000 or $8,000 on the low end to $20,000 on the high end, depending upon how big the house is. And then it just runs off natural gas. So as long as there's natural gas in the system, and as I understand it, there was in Houston, those things work great.
Yeah.
They're expensive to put in, and then you have to run them once a month just to make sure that everything's working correctly. You can get those little individual generators like they use at construction sites. They typically cost about $1,000.
Yeah.
And with that, you can run a refrigerator, and in the summer you can run a fan and that sort of thing. But you can't run your major appliances. You can't run your heating, ventilating, air conditioning systems.
Yeah.
With those little temporary things. The other thing that's pretty obvious that you could do is have an outdoor grill that runs off propane. So at least you could cook.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were doing that. Now, I heard there were over 500 cases in Houston of carbon dioxide poisoning because people took their outdoor gas grills and put them inside the house. So obviously you want to avoid doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's, you can provide some sort of source of generation. I had to do that during Harvey. It's kind of a pain. First of all, it's like a lawnmower engine. It just runs continuously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's loud. You got to change the oil every 36 hours. It's not a panacea at all, but it does get you some electricity.
Yeah, and the alternative, right? If you turn your faucet on and the water freezes coming out, changing the oil every 36 hours might not be too bad of a trade-off for
right.
And then having to shuttle your family around and duck and cover wherever anybody will allow you in. It's just been a calamity. Like we've talked about, it's like everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong. And I just feel like, again, we live in a fallen world. We're fallen humans. Government, as good as government can do, government can also get very quickly exposed. The greatest buildings of man and the greatest structures that men can come together, women can come together and build. It's a little bit of an earthquake. There was a 4.6 mag earthquake in Oklahoma on the Oklahoma-Kansas border today. Those things can topple the best man-made structures in a heartbeat. Tornado comes through, hurricane comes through. And I do think that as a follower of the Lord, as we see in Scripture, a lot of times God causes these things to happen or allows these things to happen to remind mankind of their own frailty and inability and their absolute need for him. And he just reminds us that the wisest and the greatest and the strongest and the most powerful of us, even collectively, he can still bring to our knees pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. We like to think we live in secure bubbles, but as we've seen both with the pandemic in the past year, as well as weather-related crises like the one that Houston just went through, there is no protective bubble. We're all subject to all kinds of challenges that we have to live through. Yeah.
And I'm grateful, as I know you are, because I've known you for long enough now, and I know your story and your testimony and pursuing the ways of the world versus pursuing the things of God and the assurance that comes for us in all seasons, in the darkest of winters and the brightest of summers. We're going to praise the Lord that he's faithful in all things, even though when we can't see what he's doing, we just trust that he is. Jesus never promised that it would be easy, but he did promise that he would give us peace that this world would not be able to understand. But they could see it in us if we lead into it and allow him to secure our hearts and our minds in our lives, so that when we as followers of Christ go through something like a power outage that's lasted the past 5 days, we should have a different interior experience to someone who's not following Jesus, who's walking through the exact same external experience. So my interior confidence in the Lord, am I resting in the faithfulness of my Father to take care of me in spite of the insanity, right? Like Jesus on the boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, there was an unpredicted storm that happened, and the disciples were freaking out, and Jesus was asleep, and he looked at them and says, "Oh, you have little faith." He expected them to have a different experience in the face of a very unusual weather event that these men were going through in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So ideally, Christians would not fear, but would trust in the Lord. And then those with power and with resources would share those without to their neighbors that are without. And I'm sure it's been an extremely trying time to be in Houston the last week. I just can't imagine. Everybody in the power industry, whether you're in the retail side or the wholesale side or the government side, has a huge black eye right now. Nobody's going to escape lots and lots of condemnation from the 4 million people in the state of Texas that lost power for multiple days on end.
Yeah, man. I hope between the bonfire of the media, the refusal of politicians to take responsibility for anything, corporate self-interest. I really hope that there's been enough pain and it will have endured long enough that substantive change. We got enough people caterwauling and finger pointing, and not a whole lot of change that's happening in a lot of different areas of our lives in our nation. It would be nice to see one thing at least have some positive net transformation that doesn't take 35 years to figure out how to do it. And real people in charge, people who have skill, knowledge, and expertise like yourself, can get other people out of the way to make the kind of net change that needs to happen, so that runts like me can flick a light on and not have to worry about my kids freezing overnight and loss of loved ones.
Yeah. So here's the fact that most people don't know. Texas has probably spent close to, I know they spent $7 billion building transmission lines for the wind energy in the last 10 years. They probably spent another $7 billion bringing that wind energy online, and they now subsidize it. So they subsidize it so that at night when the wind blows, oftentimes that energy is sold on a negative basis, because of the subsidy still makes it profitable for the wind guys, but it really makes it unprofitable for the conventional generation. So there's a set of regulations in place that do not promote building conventional generation to have adequate supply. And that's ultimately what's going to have to change. If Texas had spent $14 billion or more winterizing all of the generating plants, this never would have happened. But instead, 20 years ago, some public utility commissioners made a decision that we need more wind energy. And so they chose wind. They chose to spend money on wind and not on weatherizing the system.
That's awesome. How many degrees do you have to make decisions like that?
It's not that wind is bad. It's just a decision. You get what you pay for.
Yeah. Well, and going back to the beginning of what you said, and then I'll wrap this up because I know your time is precious and I greatly appreciate it. You referenced in the beginning the complex system theory, and I really appreciate what you said about whenever the system doesn't get the results that you wanted to, in due diligence, you really need to go back and look at the entire system. And it would be so nice if they would have let the adults in the room so that we can quit the politicizing of everything, and the entire system can be robustly, indiscriminately looked at so that correct solutions can be brought to the table so that we can move forward and never have to deal with this again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a Republican problem or a Democrat problem. It's just a system design issue. And it's got all kinds of public policy wrapped around it, because ultimately everybody's concerned about what they pay for electricity. So if you're willing to pay a little bit more every month, then the state can pass regulations that'll force the generators to spend the money so that the system will operate effectively.
Yeah. Hey, one of the things that I'm seeking to accomplish through a Big Deep Breath, that's the name of our Friday live stream, is that regardless of the chaos and the degree of unpredictability of life, we who follow the Lord Jesus Christ can take a big, deep breath and know that God, our Father, is absolutely faithful. He is way bigger than all. He is way bigger than all of us and all of this. There's no calamity among man that is bigger than our Father. There's nothing that man can do or destroy that can usurp the faithfulness of God to take care of his people. And we get to take a big, deep breath. And so I want to be able to have conversations with guys and gals who have skill, knowledge, and expertise in very specific industries, and bring that expertise to everybody who will have an opportunity to listen. So today we get Waters Davis, the former president of Reliant Retail. The next week we have a guy coming in whose name is Drew Willie. Drew Willie, Waters, do you know Drew?
I do not.
Oh, that's surprised. Drew is the executive director of a criminal justice ministry here in town that actively provides public defense to low-income people who cannot afford it, who the system otherwise would max out their sentences. Drew gets involved in their lives, saves the state of Texas an unbelievable amount of money, and brings about proper justice in the lives of these men and women, oftentimes getting them reduced sentences, more appropriate sentences, or no sentences at all, still receiving their just consequence. And Drew does all of that as a ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ to advance the justice of God's kingdom in our court system. And so I love being able to see the hand of God in all of these different systems. We had Luis Valdez on, Dr. Luis Valdez, who was talking about mental health a couple of weeks ago. David and Denise Glenn, marriage and family, who Waters, you're good friends with them. Waters Davis comes in and he's talking about power generation. Drew Willie's coming in and talking about criminal justice. God, our Father, is hyper practical and is involved in every single aspect of life, including all of ours. If we will just let him walk in our hearts, his will for our lives is good, it's pleasing, and it's perfect. He knows what he's doing if we will just trust in him. So Waters, thank you very much, brother, for your time. That was extremely, extremely educational for me. And hopefully this video will get shared out all over the place. So for those who need good information, can receive it from you. And I appreciate your time, brother.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Yep. Everybody else, if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel or like us on Facebook, you'll be able to get this every single week. Share it around as you'd like. Be a great help to get the word out of all that God is doing in all these different places. God bless you. Be safe, be warm, and take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon.